Our decision-making is influenced by how a problem is framed. Framing effect describes our tendency to adopt a frame as it is presented to them rather than restating the problem in their own way. What we see is all there is. You're presented with a problem, a challenge, and it's framed in a certain way. How likely are you to rephrase or reframe it in your own terms? If you're like most people, you'll probably stick with the original frame. That's perfectly human. We tend to take things at face value. So what do I mean by a frame? It's all about how a problem is presented. The same problem can evoke completely different reactions depending on whether it's framed in terms of loss or gain or choosing versus rejecting. Here is an example. There is an outbreak of a disease predicted to take 600 lives in the United States. You've got two possible plans of action to tackle the disease. Here is what you need to know. Option A, if you adopt Program A, 200 lives will be saved. Option B, if you adopt Program B, there is 1 in 3 chance of saving all 600 lives, but 2 in 3 chance that no lives will be saved. Take a moment, think it over. Which do you choose? Program A or Program B? Now let's switch up the scene. The situation is the same, but the plans are described differently. Option C. If you adopt Program C, 400 people will die. Option D. If you adopt Program D, there is 1 in 3 chance that no one will die and 2 in 3 chance that 600 people will die. Again, take your time. Which one seems more favorable now? Option C or Option D? When faced with the first scenario, most people go for Option A. But in the second scenario, the majority swing towards Option D. But programs A and C are the same as are programs B and D. The only difference is the framing, and that change of framing is enough to sway our decision. In another experiment, participants faced with a choice to prove a drug. Here are 2 framings. Framing A, the drug has a 90% survival rate. Framing B, the drug has a 10% death rate. When participants are told the drug had a 90% survival rate, they were far more likely to give it the green light. But hold on, isn't the same as saying that it had a 10% death rate. The only difference is how the information is presented. And guess what? It all comes from our brain's emotional center, the amygdala, where fear and anxiety take shape. One more experiment. Participants played an economic game with a partner. When the game was called the community game, 70% of players cooperated for mutual gain. But when the same game was rebranded as Wall Street game, the cooperation level plummeted to just 30%. The same game, different name, different outcomes. This is because different framings influence our willingness to take risk. We tend to be cautious to play it safe when choices are framed as gains. But when they are framed as losses, well, that's when we are willing to roll the dice. Parents out there, I bet you've seen the framing effect in action. You've got a test for your child and you decide to lay down the rules. If you say, you cannot do X until you've completed the task, you're using the loss framing. You emphasize the potential negative consequences and the losses associated with not finishing the task. But if you say you can do X once you've finished the task, by framing it as a gain, your focus is on the reward or privilege that awaits after completing the task. It's likely that your child responds differently to the different framings. Do you still remember anchoring bias I introduced in my earlier video? Anchoring bias is our tendency to be overly swayed by the first piece of information we are presented with. So what happens when we mash up the framing effect with anchoring bias? For example, you're in the middle of a negotiation. Your partner makes the first offer. Which sounds better to you? Option A, I'll give you X in exchange for your Y. Option B, I want your Y for my X. Pause for a moment, consider your choice. In negotiations, we don't like to feel like we're losing out. We are resistant to making concessions. But framing can play an important role here. Option A is framed as a gain. I'll give you X in exchange for Y. You are getting something. And that makes us feel more open to negotiation, less resistant to concession. But option B, with its focus on loss, immediately put us on the defensive. We think about what we are giving up and digging our heels. In 1983, a Nation at Risk report was published by the National Commission on Excellence in Education, a committee formed by the U.S. Department of Education. The report was a response to growing concerns about the quality of education in the United States, particularly in comparison with other countries. It highlighted different issues and challenges faced by the American education system at the time, such as low academic standards, inadequate teacher preparation, declining student performance, and a lack of rigor in curriculum and instruction. The report sparked a heated debate about how to improve education. To advocate for different policies, the report was framed differently between Democrats and Republicans. Democrats used the report as evidence to argue for increased federal funding and federal control over groups. On the other hand, Republicans framed the report as an indictment of ineffective federal programs and mandates from the past, in line with the Reagan administration's tax cut and policies that transferred power and responsibilities from the federal government to state and local governments. Republicans called for reducing federal control over education, pushing for state and local authorities to take charge. They also advocate for transforming federal education funding into block grants or vouchers. The same data and evidence were used to advocate for different policies by using different framings. Change, whether big or small, can be daunting. It can be seen as a threat, resisted vehemently, or it can be embraced as a promising opportunity. It all depends on how it's framed. Does the framing evoke fear or hope, anxiety or excitement? Think about the post-9/11 era. National security became a common framing to rally public support for policies. Similarly, in education, school safety has become a common narrative. Think about how your neighborhood schools frame the school safety issues. Do they use a fear-based framing that highlights the potential dangers and risks associated with inadequate school safety measures, such as surveillance system, metal detector, and armed personnel to protect students from potential threats? Or do they use a hope-based framing that promotes empathy, inclusion, and conflict resolution skills? Let's consider a recent event, the COVID-19 pandemic. As the world went into lockdown, professional conferences were canceled. Some organizations showed adept use of the framing effect to handle the registration fee. Instead of outright stating they owed attendees a refund, some organizations offered attendees options on how they'd prefer to use their refund. Option A, donate the refund to one of the organization's programs. Option B, use the refund for next year's conference registration. Option C, receive the refund via a check. I'd be interested to know which option turned out to be the most popular. I don't have data, but if framing effect holds true, my hypothesis is that many chose options A or B without a second thought. In addition to gain versus loss framing on decision-making, a frequency versus probability framing as we communicate probabilities also influence the people's decision-making. Here are two framings of a disease, and you decide which one you think is more dangerous. Disease A kills 1,286 people out of every 10,000 people. Disease B kills 24.14% of the population. Take a moment, think it over. Which disease is more dangerous? People process information differently when it's framed as a frequency, like 1,286 out of 10,000 versus a probability expressed in decimal or percentage form, like 24.14%. A study showed that many participants perceived disease A, which kills 12% of the population, to be more dangerous than disease B, even though disease B, 24.14%, nearly doubled the risk. In another study, forensic psychologists and psychiatrists were asked to evaluate the risk of a patient committing a violent crime after discharge from a mental health unit. Those professionals were more likely to rate the risk as higher when it was presented in a frequency format, like 20 out of 100 people, similar to X will commit a crime, than when it was in a probability format, such as X has a 20% chance of committing a crime. Why do we process frequency and probability formats differently? One explanation is that we're more comfortable dealing with concrete numbers than with abstract percentages. That's probably why, when reporting on the COVID-19 pandemic, the Washington Post chose to use the headline, 1 in 500 Americans have died of COVID-19, rather than stating 0.2% of Americans have died of COVID-19. The frequency format emphasized the gravity of the situation, even though the probability was the same, with different framings. Now let's say you're heading a marketing campaign aimed at encouraging high school students to use sunscreen. Here are two campaign messages you might use. Option A: did you know that just one bad sunburn can increase your chance of getting melanoma? Option B: skin damage can lead to wrinkles, dark spots, uneven skin tones, sagging skin, and rough, leathery skin. Which message do you think would resonate more with teenagers? Well, a research study showed that students who saw the beauty-focused message in option B started using sunscreen 3 times a week. But the students who watched the melanoma-focused video in option A did not change their sunscreen habits. So while teenagers might believe they are invincible, their self-image obviously holds significant sway. We often use labels to categorize certain schools and communities as high needs and certain students as at risk. But let's pause for a moment and put ourselves in the shoes of those who receive those labels. How would you personally feel if you were labeled as high needs or at risk? Just the thought of being assigned such a label may trigger a whirlwind of emotions. It could make you feel stigmatized, misunderstood, or even dismissed. The framing presented in those labels immediately shapes our perception of ourselves and others, influencing how we view our abilities, potentials, and opportunities. Let's look at how some leaders frame self-interest and group interest. It's no secret that some leaders prioritize personal gains over group interest. But what happens when a leader's self-interest clashes? How is a leader's my problem transformed into a shared our problem? Here is a scenario where a leader stands to benefit personally from initiating a war against another country. Whether it's driven by ideological pursuits, political capital building, or financial gain from arms deals, framing the war as defensive rather than offensive becomes an incredibly persuasive strategy. The war as a defense framing transforms the leader's personal agenda into a matter of collective concern. It evokes a sense of shared purpose and rallies support by appealing to our natural inclination to defend ourselves and protect our interests. After all, who could argue against the need for self-defense? Picture yourself sitting on an interview panel. You need to decide which candidate will be offered a job. You pose a question to an interviewee. How do you approach conflicts within your team? Now, consider their potential responses. Do you expect them to say, "I'm frustrated with internal conflicts and often struggle with how to handle it," or perhaps, "I can handle it very well"? It's natural for job candidates to present themselves in a positive light during interviews. But did you know that the way you framed and asked interview questions can influence the level of honesty in their responses? Let's explore 2 interview questions and their potential impact on truthful disclosure. A, you can handle internal conflicts within your team well, right? B, how much have you struggled with conflicts within your team? Did you choose A or B? Question A assumes a positive assumption, suggesting that the interviewee can handle internal conflicts without much difficulty. On the other hand, option B has a negative assumption, acknowledging the existence of a problem and prompting the interviewee to reflect on their struggles with internal conflicts. Research indicates that asking a negative assumption question, like question B, is more likely to elicit honest and truthful disclosure regarding the underlying problem of internal conflicts. By framing the question in a way that acknowledges the issue, candidates may feel more comfortable sharing their experiences and challenges. After all, which team does not have internal conflicts? Some leaders dismiss framing as mere semantics, while others skillfully leverage its power. When seeking buy-in for a new initiative, we choose a gain framing instead of loss framing. By highlighting the potential benefits and showcasing how others have already thrived, we create a compelling narrative that motivates and inspires. To challenge dysfunctional norms and rally the silent majority, we frame those who defy toxic norms as exemplifying moral, just, and courageous behavior. By doing so, we inspire others to join the cause, creating a sense of unity and shared purpose. For an even stronger impact, we may intentionally stoke fear and anxiety. We frame the proposed change as a necessary departure from the status quo, emphasizing what we stand to lose if we perpetuate toxic norms. This approach confronts people with the potential consequences of inaction, motivating them to reevaluate our stance and embrace the need for change. Start observing your decision-making process and those of others around you. See if you can spot instances of a framing effect. Please feel free to share your comments below. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.